Buddy, my name's David McLeod, and I get to preach today. Actually, I didn't know Worth was going to be in town, so I had to change a bunch of my jokes and all this stuff. That one story, I'll save it though. But no, I'm super glad to be up here. I get to going over the book of Esther right now. I really enjoy this book a lot. My daughter Madison came up and sat with me, and I just love this book. I love to tell her a story about how cool Esther is and like all these things that God did in her life and things. And so I love the book. I'm excited to do it again. If you'll open up in your program and you'll take out this paper, the scriptures there. There's an outline if you want to make notes, but everything you need is right on that paper. All right. Not often I get to say that, but it's true. And so I'm super excited about sharing to you and looking at Esther chapter 3 today, and really learning more about it. And so I want to dig deeply into this chapter. But I want to catch up. I know a lot of you are traveling, and I just want to just give you a little bit of background into this story. We're in Esther chapter 3 today, but Esther chapter 1, you meet King Xerxes. He is the king over a massive, extremely wealthy, very powerful. And some historians believe their army may have been as many as 1 million people. All right, they lost 300 ships in one battle against Greece. And they continued to move on. I mean, this is an incredibly powerful empire, and King Xerxes is the king of it. So we meet him in the first chapter. And the first chapter, he has a queen. Her name is Vashti, and things are going amazing. They just had 2 major battles, one against Greece, one against Egypt. They were successful in both of those, and there's nobody left to fight. And so Xerxes throws a 180-day party. And during those 180 days, they took all their military might. They went all over. Everybody got to see how impressive the empire was. And then he finished it. The culmination of those 180 days was a 7-day party. And that festival we read about in chapter 1. And this is what happens. At that festival, the Bible tells us how much there was alcohol, all of these things. And so in that moment, Xerxes makes a decision to invite his wife, Queen Vashti, to come in. And what he wants her to do is to show her beauty, expose herself in front of all of these noblemen, all of his friends, and display herself. And she refuses. He gets so furious. He has her deposed of being queen and banished, sent away, because he is so absolutely furious. In chapter 2, we see Xerxes. He's regretful and remorseful over his decision. He remembers her, and he's almost, you kind of get out of chapter 2 that he's disappointed that he's made the decision. But the decisions that a Persian king would make were not reversible. There was no way to go back and to fix that. So he goes and he decides he wants to have a new queen. And some of his advisors come up with this absolutely amazing idea for the first bachelor reality show ever. And they pull women from all over this empire. Some people believe as many as 1,000 women came to this city of Susa in the Persian Empire to audition for the king. They would spend one night with the king, and at the end of that, he would decide who his queen would be. And one of those women that gets called to that audition is an orphan girl, a Jewish girl named Esther. And the king is so smitten with her beauty and who she is, he calls it off and makes Esther his queen. And that's where we leave chapter 2, is Esther is now made queen. So we've had these 2 chapters where we're building to something. And if you don't know the story, it's going somewhere. You don't know yet, but today, chapter 3, the antagonist comes into the story and really changes everything. One last thing about this book. It is the only book in the entire Bible where God is never mentioned. Never mentioned once. Prayer is never mentioned. Sacrifice, all of the things that were very key and core to the Jewish people. None of those things are ever mentioned. And what I kind of wanted to show in this whole series was how God's fingerprints are all over even though he's never mentioned. That you see God's sovereignty and his providence and his care over times in our lives where we don't feel like God is there. We don't feel connected. We feel abandoned or neglected. We feel like his seeming silence is really his absence. And this story brings out to us that God really is there. God is there. And through many, many ordinary movements within the story, God is working. God is doing things. And we like the big miracle. We like the big moment when we see that's God's hand at work. But God so many times and more often works in very ordinary sets of circumstances. And the culmination of those circumstances lead us to the place we're supposed to be. So that's where we're going to look at today, the book of Esther. We continue and we meet today a very, 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 very personification of evil person. His name is Haman. All right, so let's start. We're going to start in verse 20. You can look and you can read along with me. This is God's word. But Esther had kept secret from her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all of the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for an opportunity to look into your word today. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear. Open up our hearts to you. Lord, thank you for an opportunity and just to share this beautiful story that you've preserved for us. Lord, help us to connect with it. Help us to see more clearly pride, issues like that, but really to see the beauty of sovereignty, that your providence is what controls and cares for us. Lord, thank you for that security, that peace. Lord, I pray that everything is done that's honoring and glorifying to you. And we ask this in your Son's precious and holy name. Amen. This week I read a story. I'd heard it once before, but it really sticks out to me. It was a story of a man named Nicholas Winton. And Nicholas Winton lived during some of the darkest days in all of Europe. He was a British citizen, and Nicholas saw all of these things that were happening in the world and the movement of the Nazis and all of these things. And he came up with an idea with a group of friends that they would try, because they had some deep connections in Czechoslovakia, that they would try to move children, specifically Jewish children, who were really there was really going to be difficult times ahead of them, and many of them would lose their lives. What they were going to do is they were going to start a process, kind of like the Underground Railroad, to move children out of Czechoslovakia and to the United Kingdom, and then have them paired up with families, and they would be saved, and they would have a family, and they would be spared what was coming as those forces moved in to those places on that conquest. So Nicholas Hinton started doing all of these things, and they started moving children through trains and planes. They started doing all of these different things and helping these children get connected and start a new life in the United Kingdom. Well, I was reading this story, and there was a couple things that really stuck out to me. Over the entire time that Winton was doing this, they say, through records and all the placement services, that there were 669 children that he had an opportunity to save. Not only that, but he was getting more moved out other places and started people doing it in other countries, and it became known by a German word which translated is called Kindertransport. All right, Kinder meaning child and care, and movement, obviously transport. And that's what they did. I thought this was such an amazing story, but there was a part of it that stuck out to me even more, was as Winton did all of these things, it was basically forgotten. Most people never knew who he was. And 50 years after it happened, his wife was going through a scrapbook and saw all these movements and all the paperwork and all the notations he had made to try to move each individual child, not just out of Czechoslovakia, but have them placed in a home with someone in a loving family. And she realized nobody had ever noticed this. Nobody had ever really even paid attention. He had gone unhonored, unrewarded, all of these things. And Winton wasn't the kind of guy who would bring attention to himself. So she told someone, and that person told someone else. And there was a British television program, a talk show, almost like a Donahue or an Oprah kind of thing. And they had 28 children on that show that had survived that period of time, most of them from Czechoslovakia, and they had invited Nicholas Winton to come to that show. Unbeknownst to him, all 28 children were children that he had saved. And so as the program played out, at one point they shined the lights on this man, this elderly individual, and they honored him over what he had done. And he was able to hear the stories of these children who he essentially had an opportunity to save their lives. But the whole time, 50 years, he goes unnoticed, unrewarded, unhonored for this incredible thing he had done. And if you can for a moment just think about what that is, those feelings of unrewarded or not being honored for something, not being recognized for something that's hugely important, and in Nicholas's case, in a humanitarian sense, absolutely monumental. You get a little bit of the spirit of where our passage starts today. Because here's Mordecai. Mordecai is the cousin who has raised Esther from the time that she was orphaned. He cares for her as a father. And Mordecai is there at the city gate where all the commerce and all the travel and all the laws and all this stuff happens. And he overhears a conversation. By the sovereignty of God, he hears a conversation where two men are plotting an assassination attempt on King Xerxes. Well, he hears this, and he reports what he hears to Esther. Esther, the queen, goes to the king and says, listen, this is what's going to happen. That whole thing is investigated, found out to be true, and both of those two men are put to death. Now, those two men were very significant. Both of them sat in a place in the doorway of the king. They would have had access to him very easily, and most likely, had it been able to run its course, that assassination plan would have come true, and Xerxes would have been assassinated. God gives this special thing to Mordecai. And what happens is, as soon as Mordecai and the whole thing happens, he's unhonored. He's unrewarded. Nobody notices it. And if you look back at our passage, it says this, and when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals of the presence of the king. And all of a sudden, the next chapter starts. And you would expect the next chapter to start with, and Mordecai was lifted up to a very high position. But that's not what happens. In fact, it's another person. If you look at verse 1, you meet our antagonist, the one who causes all of the problems. I would call him the personification of evil. You meet a man named Haman. Now, if you look at that first verse, it says this, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. In a place that Mordecai probably should have wanted to be at, a place of recognition, of honor, of importance, all of a sudden what happens is Xerxes actually elevates Haman to number 2 in all of the Persian Empire. And you stop for just a second. You're like, how could they do that? How could they just forget about what Mordecai had just done? But there's something so much more to the story. And I'd like you for just a moment, if you're like older like I am, Put on your Perry Mason right now, all right? Go Matlock. I couldn't really think of like a more modern, contemporary, maybe Jack Ryan, I don't know. But for a moment, put on your investigative skills, because here when it talks about Haman and it tells us who he's a son of, and when it attributes him to a family, you start to see that this story is so much bigger than a really bad guy going up against a really good guy, that there's such depth and history to this story. And it calls Haman an Agagite. That might seem like something that's just not important, but it's actually hugely important. If you go back into other books like 1 Samuel chapter 15, if you look in Exodus, all these places, you become introduced to a group of people called the Amalekites. And their king was named Agag. And the Amalekites were a very, very, very horrible group of people. The things that are recorded that they did are disgusting and perverse, and atrocities would be attributed to this group of people. And God, as he's moving his people out of the promised land and the Amalekites attack under the leadership of Agag, God gets so angry, he makes a judgment and desires to bring justice against the Amalekites and their king Agag. So he goes and he has Saul told exactly what he wants as judgment to bring justice over this group of people. Well, Saul is told that he's supposed to go bring this judgment, bring justice to this group of people. And he goes and he starts to do it pretty well. He goes and there's a huge battle, and God gives the victory to the Israelites. But two things really, that Saul was told not to do, he chose to do. One was this. He takes Agag, disobeying God. He takes Agag, this king, and he brings him back to the people of God as a trophy of what had just happened. In other words, it's his own pride that comes out of like, look what I did. Look what I've got. I've got the king, and look, we can make fun of him. We can do whatever, Here is Agag. And God had said, do not do that. And the second thing that God had told them not to do, that Saul willingly chooses to do, is they were not supposed to take any of the things of the Amalekites. And Saul brings cool stuff back. And he disobeys God in doing so. He brings back the spoils of war. And the point of God's people was, you don't bring stuff back for you because I gave you this victory. You leave it there. Do not bring their stuff back. And Saul, on both counts, chooses to disobey God. And he brings Agag, and he brings all this stuff back. And you start to see this whole series of things that the Agagites, the Amalekites, hate God's people. And there is constant warring between them. And there's this whole long thing. And Saul's disobedience ends up going generation after generation after generation of huge pain for God's people because he didn't obey. So when it says here that Haman was an Agagite, this is saying something really, really important. But there's also another person in this story. Mordecai. He's one of the very important people of this story. He's the cousin who raises Esther as an orphan child. Well, in chapter 2, we learn a little bit about his family. In chapter 2, it tells us that he's a son of Kish, that he is from the tribe of Benjamin. And all of a sudden, some things really, really start to make sense. Because Kish was the father of King Saul, the one who had disobeyed. He was a Benjamite. And so you start to see there's this whole history when Haman is part of the Agagites, and you see over here Mordecai is really directly related to Saul. You start to see a collision course here of where there's going to be a huge problem. There is going to be a huge battle, and it's a lot more than just a problem between two men. One commentator says this: Haman's ancestry is mentioned to show that he was an enemy of the Jews by birth, and that it was more than just personal hatred of Mordecai that motivated him. See, these two had history that went back many, many generations between them. And you start to see this evil man, Haman, and you see the background story, and you see the hatred, and you see the lineage that he comes from, and the things that they were capable of doing, the things they tried to do to God's people. And the story starts to get really thick, really, really fast. Haman is such an interesting character. I want to read to you a little bit more about him. If you look back at your text, You look here in verse, we'll start at verse 1. I want to see what he does. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha, an Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than any of the other nobles. All of the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay honor to him, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. You see what happens here with this guy, Haman, a horrible person. Just because he doesn't get bowed down to, all of a sudden the creation of genocide comes to his mind. Just because one person won't bow down and recognize him, all of a sudden he just doesn't want to kill that person. He wants to kill everybody. I start reading, and the more you read into Haman, more that you read into his story, I kind of felt like there's a personality disorder at work here. All right, this is something extremely challenging. And I pulled out the DSM, if you know, you can pull that out. And I kind of knew where I was going with it. And I picked out 5 things about Haman that I want to bring up today. But more importantly, I want you to kind of understand where I'm trying to go. I want you to fall in love with the book. I want you to connect with it. I want you to love reading it. But there's so much here for you and for me. I want us to see a little bit today, the core of Haman's problem is a huge issue with pride. Huge issue with pride that became narcissistic and ended up being in a place of absolute destruction. His desire was to destroy people because he felt maimed as a person. Another thing I want us to see is how God's sovereignty is over tragedies, things that we can't control. Because when I read stories about people in the Bible, sometimes you see sort of one of 2 things happen. Sometimes you see the people's brokenness, their own struggle with an internal problem, their own sin, their own personal bad decisions cause a problem, and you see how God intervenes in that problem. You see how God rescues them, how there's grace and forgiveness for them. But you also see, on the other hand, another thing that happens in the Bible, especially these kind of stories, which is when tragedies happen. When those tragedies that are outside of people's control, meaning it's an external action on someone else's part that causes huge problems for that person. I want us to see that God is sovereign not only over our bad decisions and that he can take those things and give hope and reconciliation and restitution to those things. But I also want us to see how he takes the tragedies, the things that happen to us that are not our doing, that it's someone else's sin that impacts us, how God is sovereign over those things too. And Haman is a tragedy. Haman is a tragedy for the people of God because he is looking to annihilate and exterminate man, woman, and children. That's what he's looking to do. That is his depravity on display. I picked out 5 things about Haman I kind of want us to look at for just a moment that really kind of fuel this guy. The first one is this. He has a grandiose sense of self-importance. Number 2, he has a need for constant praise and admiration. And look how this plays out here. If you didn't catch it in the reading, the king makes a decree that people were to bow, honor, and recognize Haman when he was around. But I heard this week, that was extremely unusual because in this culture, in Persian culture, bowing down to somebody was a way of just honoring them. It wasn't worship, it was just something that they did. And so the king has to go and set a law, a rule that you got to bow to Haman, right? That means he probably was a real jerk of a person, right? People they didn't do that normally to him. They didn't like him. So the king, because they didn't do it and Haman wanted it done, it looks like the king just decided, okay, all right, everybody has to bow to this guy, all right? And you see sort of the personality of Haman to me coming out, where Haman has to have it about him. It has to be about him. It's a demand for recognition in his life. And if he doesn't get it, we see how he acts. The third thing about him, he has a sense of entitlement, a belief that he is unique, important, superior to others, and he demands resources of others that aren't normal for people. The fourth thing, he exploits others without guilt or shame, and he has a complete lack of empathy. And to me, that's sometimes the biggest thing that stands out is his lack of empathy. You read through this story, and this guy never in any way shows any love for anyone else but himself. When he's pushed into a corner, he cries for himself. But he will not care or cry for anyone else. He only is about himself 100% of the time. And we look at this story, and I always try to bring out these characters because I want us to look at them. I want us to learn something from it. But you might look at this and say, well, how do you learn anything from him? He's such an extreme example of narcissism and pride. But I kind of take a little bit from that. Like maybe you remember this, like when you were younger, your parents would say, hey, don't do what so-and-so does, be careful, like they make bad choices, learn from that. I see Haman as you really see the roots of pride in his life and what it could possibly become. And I'll tell you this, whether you like it or not, this is my belief. Every single one of us struggles with pride in some way. It's pride that makes every conversation have to go back to us. It's pride that's so evident when we feel like we should be recognized or honored and nobody does it. I remember back in high school, when I was a senior, I thought I was supposed to win this award as a senior. I really thought, I had actually been working for it, to make sure I got it, like a really humble person would. And you know what? And when we had our big event at the end of, I did not win that award, someone else did. And I was so unhappy about that. And I see, and even remembering the story, I feel like how I felt like maimed. I felt like unimportant. I felt like I didn't get something I had deserved. And believe me, I had a whole resume of reasons why I should have won that award. And I see that pride in me. And I think it's pride that we see in problems in a marriage where you just cannot admit you're wrong, where it just becomes pervasive. And I think people get divorced because of pride. But pride is dangerous. Pride is dangerous because it's subtle. It's very quiet how it works. It's not one of those big sins that people just come out and say, hey, here I'm really struggling with pride this week. No, it's something that embeds itself very deeply. I think it's that kind of thing that makes family feuds go on for years. It's where you can remember everyone else's faults, but you can't be honest about your own. And it roots itself very deeply in us as people. And I'm telling you, pride can also be extremely religious. Like, if you think about religion and the way that it works, you can say, I go to every service and I've memorized tons of scripture and I've really involved my life in all of these things. And all of a sudden, you've got pride over all the stuff you've done and all the stuff that you know. But it's also pride where people can sit in church their whole lives and not know God because they've never gotten to a place of humility that says, I'm broken, I'm a sinner, and I need the saving grace of Jesus Christ in my life and accept the gift. Pride is what doesn't allow us to be repentant. Pride is what doesn't allow a mother or a father to tell their children, hey, I was wrong and I love you and I'm sorry I did this, and fix that relationship and model for kids what it means to be humble and honest, and on and on and on. Because at the heart and at the very, very core of pride, same thing that Haman has, the same thing I'm saying that all of us struggle with, really at the core of pride is self-worship. It's elevating oneself above others. You see it if you see somebody you don't like, or you see a group of people you don't like, and you kind of just feel better. You elevate yourself over them. You say things. Maybe it's a little underhanded. Maybe it's very politically correct, but you still get it across. That's pride letting itself out. That's pride, and it's doing the thing that's so damaging. And I look at Haman's life, Here's a guy who's filled with pride. It has to be about him. It has to be focused on him. People have to reverence him constantly. And when Mordecai decides not to do it, and we know a little bit of the family history on these two, when Mordecai decides not to do it, Haman flies into a genocidal rage and starts plotting and planning the demise of God's people. You see the damage of what pride can do. Look at this for just a second. You think about it. God had promised his people he would take care of them. God had promised his people that he would care for them, that they would be a special group of people, that they would be protected. And here they are, exiled in the Persian Empire. They had adopted the culture around them. They had adopted all of these things. And all of a sudden the question is, and I think it really comes out in this passage is God going to honor his covenant with his people? Is he going to honor it even though they were so far from him? And God does something so cool by raising up this little orphan girl. Beautiful. The text tells us that she was so beautiful. But God has raised Esther up into a place of being queen. And you start to see the way that God is sovereign, how his providence is over even really horrible times, even tragedies of a man like Haman and his desire to exterminate and annihilate a whole group of people. You see how God is still working over all of those details. Let's read a little bit more of the story. Let's connect with it a little bit deeper. I'm going to look at verse 8. It says, "Then Haman said to King Xerxes, 'There's a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury.' So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and the enemy of the Jews. 'Keep the money,' the king said to Haman. 'Do with the people as you please.' Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out the script of each province and in the language of each people, all Haman's orders to the king's satraps and governors of the various provinces and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. The dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder all their goods." This is what Haman comes up with. And now he has carte blanche ability to take on everything that he wants. Haman is the personification of evil. Haman is the antithesis of what we see Mordecai is in this story. He's the antithesis of what God calls us to be as people. We're to be people who care about the image of God. We're to be people who care about those that are struggling. We're to be people that care just as we've been cared for, being a conduit of God's grace into our culture, into our community, into the neighborhood that God has called you to. That's who we're supposed to be. But Haman is the example of what is the exact opposite. The book of Proverbs says this in strong language about how God feels. It says, "There are 6 things which the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to evil, a false witness who utters lies, and one who spreads strife among others." See, if you look at that Proverbs couple of verses, you found Haman. You found who Haman is. Every single thing in there is applicable to Haman as a person. And you see the tragedy as it's laid out in front of God's people. You see the tragedy that none of them would have ever picked, and all of a sudden, it's there. And all the postal service sends out, everybody in their own language gets a copy of Haman's order signed by King Xerxes, and it's going to happen. And not only is it going to happen, But a psychological element to this is when the decree goes out from the time the extermination actually begins is 11 months. So you can imagine the angst, the anxiety, the stress, the hurt that people must have gone under on when they felt this. And it wasn't just the Jewish people. The text tells us a little bit later that it's the whole empire. The whole empire is stressed by this because this was a melting pot of an empire. These were neighbors. These were these were friends. Your kids played together. This was all going to happen. But when something got decreed like this, people were expecting it to happen. And you see the travesty, you see the tragedy that are in front of God's people. And I think we experience those kinds of tragedies, not to the same level maybe, but we experience tragedies that we have no control over in our lives. I want us to see that God is sovereign, over these things. And you see it play out, you see how it happens here. And I think, how do we deal with these kinds of things? How do we deal with those tragedies that present themselves to us? I think one of those ways is we look over the timeline of our lives that God has given to us. Ways that we've seen him care for us over the past. Maybe it's in ordinary circumstances, or maybe it's been in really big ways, but how God has cared for us in some of our darkest moments. I remember, one of those that I go back to in my life was when I found out that our youngest was in deep trouble right before he was supposed to be born. An emergency surgery took place, and thank goodness that Luke survived that whole thing. And I look back because our doctor had called us and switched an appointment to 3 days earlier, and the doctor told us if we would have kept that appointment, he wouldn't have made it. I look back at that and I say, God was so good. Sometimes when I look in that little boy's face, I just thank God, because in that moment, that place in my timeline, I really saw God's hand of love and action on my part. And I think sometimes when we have tragedies in our lives, we take just a moment and we reflect back on what God has done. In the next chapter, Esther is presented with this whole thing. She reads what Haman plans to do. And she asks Mordecai to ask the people to fast, which is a time to remember what God has done, a time to commit themselves to him. Even though God is never mentioned in the book, she asks them to fast for 3 days and 3 nights as she prepares to talk to the king. One of those ways is looking over our timeline. One of them is looking at the promises that God has given to us. Things like he'll never leave us or forsake us, that God cares for us, that he'll never let us go, and reflecting back on those promises. Sometimes for me, it's a third thing. It's looking back over these stories that God has given to us. A story like Esther, where we have a beginning and we have an end, and we see the way he works, and we see the way that his focus is on the preservation of the people that he's made a covenant, a promise with. And you see his faithfulness to that covenant and to that promise. And a fourth thing that really sticks out to me when we look at the tragedies, the difficult things that we go through, is how God, with great frequency, and it's an evidence, I believe, of the way he works, is how God raises up one person. How God raises up one person over and over again to rescue his people. And I'll read a quote to you. In the midst of all of this, God was not sleeping, even though to the Israelite people it may have felt that way. In his sovereign plan, he determined one person would make an enormous difference. Again, one individual would stand in the gap for his people. On this occasion, her name is Esther. You start looking over whether it's Abraham or whether it's Moses, or whether you move forward and you see others that do it. It's David. It's all of these people. God will raise up a person, usually an unlikely person, someone you're not expecting to be a hero of the story. God raises them up and rescues his people through that person. The whole book of Judges plays out like this. And I see it, and I see the frequency with which this happens. And sometimes when I look at tragedies or things are really difficult, I think the beauty that God raised up one, that Jesus came to earth, that Jesus came as a baby and he's born in the most rudimentary and difficult type of circumstances, nothing fitting of a king. But he lives a perfect life, fully God and fully man, and he goes all the way to the cross. And there are similarities in the stories here. There's a genocide that you see that's happening at Haman's desire and plan. And there was a genocide that was happening at Jesus' birth too, because Herod finds out that a king is supposed to be born in this little city. So what does he do? He goes and he has all the baby boys murdered so that there can't be a king. God spares Jesus. That's his plan. But you see how genocide was part of the very beginning of Jesus coming to earth. And I also thought to me there was something that stuck out too. It's that Haman promises the king a massive load of silver to let him do this. And you think for just a second, that's what Judas paid for Jesus. That was the bribe that was given to Judas so that he delivered over Jesus to those officials. And you think for just a second how God raised up one. How God raised up one to do the work that we couldn't do for ourselves. How Jesus goes all the way to the cross and takes on him a completely undeserved punishment, but he does it for us. He does it because he loves and he cares for us. And you can see love and care all over the book of Esther. Even though it's never mentioned, you see how God is plotting the points, how he's taking care of his people, how he's not going to let Haman get away with this whole thing. You see the way God cares for us, that he sent Christ, that he gave his life for us, that he didn't stay there in a tomb. There's a resurrection, which gives us hope. And I look at this story, and I think how beautiful it is. How beautiful, how one person, this young girl, is raised up into a place where she actually has an opportunity to save all of her people from this horrible, horrible plan by a guy named Haman. You think about that for just a second. How God cares for us, not just in our sins with forgiveness and by redeeming those things, but how God cares for us in the tragedies that you and I would never pick, sometimes at the hands of someone who's so bent on their own pride and desire. God cares for us. He's sovereign and his providence is good even over those moments too. We see it play over this whole story. This morning when I opened up, I talked to the story of Nicholas Winton, this guy who had saved 669 children and had them put into homes where they were loved and cared for. And out of those 669 children, only about a couple of hundred of them have been actually able to chart their whole story through. And I started reading about a few of those people, a few of those children that were saved by Nicholas Winton in those days. And one of them stood out to me. And it was a woman, her name was Renata Laksana. She was a young girl in Czechoslovakia. And he saved, this guy, Nicholas, made sure that she was on a train and she got away and she went to the UK and then eventually from the United Kingdom, she was sent to America where she grew up. She went to school and she actually became this amazing pediatric doctor. She became the professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin at Madison as she developed vaccines and did all of these things to preserve children's lives, something that happened to her. She now became doing that same work here in the United States, impacting possibly even people here with vaccines and things that were designed. And I see the tree of Nicholas Winton. If we think of it as a tree, here's this guy who put his life on the line, who did this very daring action to save people's lives. And what happened? Children were saved, and the tree starts to grow with those people, those children going out and developing and doing things. And you see what the preservation of life actually represents. Where now, here's this woman, Renata, who does the exact same work in a sense of saving others. And you see this beautiful tree that came out of one person's actions. God set Nicholas Winton aside, I believe, for a very special job of preserving lives by caring for children, by making sure that they got away. And I see the beautiful story of Esther, and I see how it leads us to the one of Jesus Christ, how God in his grace and his providence in our lives is preserving us as a people, how he cares for the very small things, the micro things, and the macro things that we experience. He's active. And that beautiful tree, that seed that's Jesus, grows into this massive tree of redemption and forgiveness and of rescue. And today, out of this beautiful story of an orphan girl, an unlikely hero, I see the beautiful providence and sovereignty of God, even in spite of tragedies that we go through as people. Let's pray. Dear Father, thank you for loving us and caring for us. Thank you for mercy and grace in our lives. Lord, I pray today that we will connect with what it means to be yours, that it won't be something that's nebulous and far away, but that we'll really see in a tangible way that you're working in our lives. Thank you for the beautiful story of Esther. What a special woman. Lord, thank you for preserving her story. Lord, thank you. We see her growth as a person from when she starts off, and she doesn't start off very well, but she's such a different person at the end. I see the way that you commit yourself and you care for us as people, because that's our story too. Father, I pray that you would bless us. I pray that we would know you more. Help us to see more of your grace. Open up our eyes to how good you are. And we ask all of these things in your Son's precious and holy name. Amen.
Please.